had to leave our ordinary schools and go to Jewish schools, which by itself is okay, because nowadays people even choose Jewish schools to take their children. But at that time, what happened, the Nazis came with trucks and told the children to go on the truck, and the parents waited in the evening for the children to come home, and they didn't turn up, and they went to the police and didn't get any information. They even went to the Nazis, the Gestapo, and they didn't tell them anything. And only after the war did one hear they were as well just murdered in Mauthausen. So you can imagine how scary it was to go out in the street or even staying at home, because the knock on the door could come and they could take you away. People had no rights whatsoever. And then after 2 years like this, in June 1942, about 10,000 young people between the age of 16 and 25 got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany to work in German factories. My brother Heinz, who was 16, and Anne's sister Margot, 16 as well, and many, many of their friends got this postcard. And our parents, the Frank family, and my father, and many, many others decided they wouldn't send their kids. Because, you know, why had they thrown out the Germans, Jewish people first, and then suddenly they wanted them back. They didn't trust that rightly. Because again, those parents who did send children never ever saw them again anymore. So my father called us together and said he has found in all the occupied countries, and that was a very important movement, was a resistance movement, meaning people obviously who didn't like to be occupied by a foreign power, and especially not the Germans, who didn't like the local population and did terrible things, even to non-Jewish people. And so this resistance did all kinds of things. They worked together with the British, who threw down weapons and radios and pamphlets, and helped pilots who were shot down and all kinds of things. But also they risked their life, and that is very, very important, risked their life to keep in Jewish people, to try to keep them safe. And my father called us together and told us he had found people, and beforehand was going to go to this call-up notice, we are going to go into hiding, meaning we are going to disappear. And I started to cry. I didn't want to be separated. And my father explains, if we are in two different places, the chance that two of us will survive might be greater. I was 13 years old, and he mentioned survive. That was really the first time when I started to be frightened. And yes, it was a matter of life and death.
And you spent 2 years in hiding with your mother. I can't imagine what that would be like. Can you talk a little bit about what happened during those 2 years?
Yes, and the Germans knew, I told you 10,000 young people had to come, but about, I don't know exact figure, certainly not more than half did come. And so they really wanted to catch every Jew. So they made house searches. In the night, they knocked on doors, ordinary Dutch homes. People had to open, let the Nazis come in, let them search their home, and look for Jewish people. So in every hiding place where we were, again, people from the resistance came and made a hiding place within the hiding place. Meaning they made a false partition in a room, sometimes in a wardrobe, sometimes even under floorboards if there was a high enough space. So at night when we heard that knock, we quickly had to quickly go there, hoping they wouldn't find us. So you can imagine it was scary, and we didn't dare to sleep. And then we heard the story that again in another house they went, and there were people, and they felt the beds, and they were still warm. So they realized there were people there. So they demolished the whole house till they found everybody. And of course the people who hid them were taken away as well. Well, and if people hear stories like that, the people who hid us said, well, we can't take the tension any longer, you have to look for a different hiding place. So my mother and me moved perhaps to 6, 7 different addresses in those 2 years, and my father and brother as well. And after 2 years being in hiding, my father was in the country with Heinz, and he phoned my mother and said, the woman where they are staying is blackmailing them for more money. And can you imagine, if you can't earn a living and you have to pay for your keep, our money started to run out. And my father said to my mother, please find us a hiding place. And it took about 3 weeks for my mother to find a safe house, but it turned out not to be safe. It was a Dutch nurse who was really a double agent. She really worked for the Nazis, but pretended she was a member from the resistance. And so when my father and brother went there, the next day the Nazis came in with their own key and knew the people where they were staying and took them away. And my mother and me had just moved as well, and this was very, very near where my father and brother had just moved. And on the Sunday when they moved there, we went to visit them. And they followed us. And on Tuesday morning, 11th of May, was my 15th birthday, there was a knock on the door in the morning, and the Nazis stormed in and took us away, because they knew who they were looking for. So you can imagine that's a birthday we'll never ever forget.
And so you and your father and mother and brother were on the train and you ended up at Auschwitz. And you met Mengele, the angel of death. Could you talk a little bit about that, please?
We were arrested on a Tuesday. On Friday, because usually you were taken to a holding camp, you might be there 3 weeks, even 3 months. If you would have stayed there, we would certainly all have survived. But we were immediately taken on transport eastward, and of course they never told you where you were going. You might have seen pictures of this transportation of Jewish people in cattle trucks, goods train. There was definitely not meant for human transportation, not even for cattle. There was nothing in it, just the boards. They put 2 buckets in, one for toilets and one for water. Once a day they pushed the doors open and threw bread in, like you would feed wild animals. And there was practically no air, so it was a horrific journey. And eventually we arrived, and the doors were thrown open. It was a beautiful May day, and we heard dogs barking and lots of shouts and orders, and there were lots and lots of people, Nazis and inmates, and so you had to jump down. And the next command, if anybody of you had ever been in Auschwitz, Auschwitz is a big man camp, but it was a huge, huge area of, I think, 20 square miles of areas, and there were many, many camps. Buchenau was a woman, not Birkenau. Birkenau. Birkenau, sorry. Birkenau was a women's camp, with barracks were just erected for a couple of years, as long as the Jewish transport were going to be, and then this whole thing was going to be, well, it was it wasn't built for lasting anyway. And so the first command was men and women to different sides. The men were marching to the Auschwitz camp, which was about 3 miles from where we arrived. You can imagine that scene. Fathers and daughters, husband and wife, saying goodbye to each other, assuming that they will never ever see each other on earth. So people started to cry and cling to each other. My father, like I told you, was not a religious man, but he took me by the hands and said, God will protect you. He realized I'll be on my own, and he hopes just that I would be protected by God. and then they marched away. And the next thing was, like you mentioned, there was a camp doctor, Dr. Mengele. He was perhaps 35 years, a proper medical doctor, but he wasn't there to help people with illnesses, to cure them. He was there to decide who was going to live and who was going to die. Later on in the women's barrack, he made experiments on women. He operated on women without anesthetic, of course, taking out a kidney, for instance, to see how long people could live that way, injecting them with all kind of material which was not meant for going into human bodies. All kind of horrible, horrible experiments he made. But the first thing at arrival, our first selection was taking place, meaning you had to stand in rows of 5. He looked you over just a second and decided this side or this side, life or death. We lost about half of our Dutch transport, meaning there were no children. Older people, it didn't go by age, it just looked how you looked. Some people had had a terrible journey, even if they might have been 30 or 40 years, looked perhaps very pale, went to the wrong side. Of course, they didn't tell us sides. They just said, this group will go there, the other group will go there. So my mother and me and about 400 people marched into Birkenau. You might have seen this picture with a tower, and camp was with electrified barbed wire surrounded. And the Birkenau, there were many camps, A, B, C, D camp. New arrivals never went where people were already. They didn't want that we would tell the news what was going on outside. So we had no idea what was going, how the war was going. But we were entered into a huge, huge barrack. The next command, undressed completely naked, and the young Nazi boys were laughing at our embarrassment. Then we were all tattooed with a number, and they told us, you're not like a human being, you're like cattle who is marked with a number. Whichever we want you, we are going to be called, you're going to be called out just by your number. Forget you have a name. The next thing, all our hair was shaved, and while this was going on, they told us with much, much pleasure that the family you've been separated from, were told they were going to have a shower. And they went there quite happy to, after this terrible hot journey, and they stood there naked, and there were pipes, so it looked as if there were shower pipes, and they waited, and nothing happened. And they asked the other side, quite big places, any water come in your pipes there? No. And people started to have breathing difficulties, and within 10 minutes, people just really couldn't breathe and fell to the floor and were dead. Because through those pipe came this very, very poisonous gas, Cyclone B. And they told us that. Can you imagine how a mother felt who had just been separated from her child? And then, when we were finished there, they said, and now it's your turn to go into a shower. Of course, we didn't want to go. We just stood stock still, and then they called more troops, and we were herded into the shower barrack, but water came. Then, still naked, we were driven out like cattle, you know, and there were 2 big heaps, one with rags, sort of clothes, and the next one with shoes, and we were thrown 1 garment. That was all we ever had. Just could have been a winter coat, could have been a summer dress, whatever, 1 garment, no underwear, nothing. And 2 shoes, of course, never a pair, just from a heap, and never your size. So that was our belongings. Then we were herded into barracks, which were bunks 3 high, about 1.5 yards, and 8 people slept in there. Again, only boards, no blankets, no straw, nothing. In the morning, we had to stood up in front of the barrack, and the whole camp was counted, which took 2 hours. Then we got our breakfast, which was a mug of some liquid, and then we were taken out to work. From morning early to late at night, without a break, no food, no drink, no toilet break, till late at night. Back to the barrack, again a roll call, 2 hours standing, then you got your chunk of bread, and then you went back into your bunk. Day in, day out, the same thing, hard physical labor. And we were covered in lice and bed bugs. The water wasn't clean. Many people got typhus, cholera, dysentery. Many died. It happened very often that you woke up and the person who slept next to you didn't wake anymore. So you can imagine the situation became worse. People became weaker, it became winter, it was freezing cold. And that anybody survived is a miracle. And we were really not supposed to survive.
You used the word miracle. You were at the doorstep of death when you were in Auschwitz, and yet you survived through a series of miracles. Could you talk a little bit about them?
Well, the first miracle was that I was not taken away because I was 15 and many girls who were even 16, 17 were taken away. But I had just a summer dress how I was arrested. But my mother got a hat and coat. And I don't know why, because it was summer and we didn't sing, we had any life. My mother said, "Where's this hat and coat?" She gave it to me. And this hat had a big rim. And when Mengele looked at me, he didn't see how young I was. So this definitely saved me my life at the beginning. My mother was 93 years old when she died. Until her dying days, she always said to me, she had dementia, but said she remembered, you remember when I saved your life, when I gave you my hat and coat. And that was really true. The other thing was that at work, there was one place which was nicknamed Canada because it was sort of was a nickname because it was better work and it was like freedom and better food and so on. And that was every transport brought a lot of things with them, and all this was confiscated and had to be sorted out. And when we arrived in May, in June then, the Hungarian people were picked up. And every day, thousands of Hungarian people arrived. And for those people, there were no selections. All of them went to the gas chambers. But all the things which they brought with them had to be sorted. So my mother and me was chosen to work in this Canada. We worked there for 3 weeks, which was not such hard work, and as well we found a lot of food. And one of my jobs was to open the hems of garments and find things which people had hidden, so perhaps they thought with gold or with money or with jewelry they might bribe their way back to freedom. And we had to pick this out and hand it over to the Nazis. So I did that with my mother for 3 weeks. We definitely lengthened our chance to live. And then we had come with as well amazing. I got typhus one day as an attack, and my mother realized I had to have medicine, and she wanted to take me to the hospital. But the inmates who were there longer said, "Oh, you mustn't take Eva to the hospital because she'll never get out there. She'll fall into the clutches of Mengele." But my mother said, well, Eva would die anyway. So she took me there. And who should she meet there? At the entrance of the hospital barrack, a cousin from Prague who had been deported, and she worked for Dr. Mengele. That was one of her jobs. And she was able to give me some medication without admitting me into hospital. And later, the next miracle, and that was really the most amazing what happened. Once, it might have been October or November, we entered the shower. Once a week we had a shower and we were deloused. And we came out of the shower and there stood Mengele with his SS guard, and the selection was taking place. And I, naked, of course, we passed in front of him and he passed me. And my mother, she was very tall anyway, and like any mother would do, she very often had given me some of her bread ration. And she really had become very, very thin and didn't look very, very strong anymore. And she, with 40 other women, were taken away and going to be gassed. And our other groups of people were moved to another part of the camp, and I only knew that I had lost my mother. That was for me, as you can imagine, another couple of months, very, very difficult. And it was winter and it became really very, very cold, where sometimes I lost my shoes and I was walking barefoot. And I was on the point of giving up. And I was at work and a Nazi called me and said, I'm wanted. So I thought, well, that's it. And so I went there to a place, and who should stand there? My father. This is to this day, I have no idea how he knew where I was, how he was allowed to come and see me. I just don't know. I have no explanation whatsoever. And of course, my father asked me where Mutti was, and I told him that she had been gassed. Well, this man just crumpled in front of my eyes. He you know, that was for him the most horrible news he could get. And I asked how my brother was, and he said, he's okay. And I saw him, he came still twice, and then I never ever saw him again. And the Russians were approaching. They didn't tell us that, but we felt it. That is when the Frank family were as well betrayed in August, so after us came with the last transport from Holland in September, and the girls, Anna and Margot, were taken out of Auschwitz and taken to Bergen-Belsen, a camp in Germany. And that was when the Germans, many guards fled, but as well they took most of the inmates from that camp, Auschwitz and Birkenau, took them to Germany and Austria, because they didn't want us to be liberated by the Russians, to be free. The threat had been going out. In Birkenau, those were wooden barracks, that when the Germans were leaving completely, they were going to lock up those barracks and burn the whole camp down, so not to leave any signs behind. And but by luck, my mother and me stayed behind. So staying in Auschwitz saved our lives, because those transports were after the war called the death marches, because most people, of course, couldn't make it.
The Russians liberated Auschwitz January 27th, 1945. How did you find out that Otto Frank was still alive?
Well, the Russians came, fed us, stayed the night with a field kitchen, and then went again in pursuit of the Nazis. And so we were left again. There were about 300-400 women left in Birkenau. And there was snow, it was cold, there was nothing really. We didn't know what to do. So I decided I would go to the men's camp to try to find my father and brother. So it was very dangerous because there was fighting going on around us, but I managed to find it. And in Auschwitz there were as well about 400 or 500 men left. And I looked all in all the barracks, and I came across one person who looked so little bit familiar, but he looked really very old and thin and bad, really bad, and he had only rags on him. But I went to him and I said, I think I know you. And he said, yes, I'm Otto Frank. And you're Eva Geiringer. I said, yes, Anne's friend. And so he asked me, of course, as you can imagine, immediately, have you seen my girls or my wife? But I hadn't seen them. But he had seen my father and brother. So at that time, I thought, well, the war will be very soon finished, and we will be all right again. We will all be all right. Because what I hadn't told you, that my mother was alive, and I came across her. So this was, of course, amazing. Real, I can only call it a miracle.
Sure. When did Otto learn that his family had perished?
Well, then the war wasn't finished yet. So it took till May, till the end of the war. By that time, the Russians had taken us eastward because there was fierce fighting in Poland, and they didn't want us to fall back into the hands of the Nazis. They were, and that I must stress, they were very, very considerate. They gave us Russian uniforms, they fed us, they gave us medication if necessary. There was no raping at all. They were really very, very good to us. And eventually, we ended up in Odessa, so they took us out of danger. And there we waited for the end of the war. And then when that was, then a New Zealand troop transport ship came and transported us through the Mediterranean to Marseille, and then up to France, Belgium, and eventually back to Holland. That took from January to June. We were on the way all the time, looked after by wonderful people, partly army, partly civilians, and all those occupied countries had suffered. There was everywhere little food, little of anything, but everybody really looked very, very well after us. Only when we got to Holland, they dropped us at the station, and that was it. And we were very surprised. We expected a welcoming committee or anything, but nothing. And then we heard, all the occupied countries were liberated already early. France, Belgium, Greece, Denmark, but Holland was occupied till the end of the war. And the Germans took everything the Dutch produced to feed their own people, understandably. And so in Holland it was called the hunger winter. There were no cats and dogs anymore. Everything had been eaten. Tens of thousands of people perished in their own apartment just from starvation. Can you imagine such a situation? The people went to the farmers, came back with one potato to feed a family of 5. Impossible. So when more people came from Germany, from the refugees, liberated people, and we came through Belgium and France, they didn't really have anything to give us. And they were all really very miserable and depressed. It took several months before the Allies, the British and the Americans were able to get food and things again to this Dutch population. So, coming back home was again really a disaster. And Otto Frank, and we all